Good morning, everyone. It's November 13 at 10 a.m. convened meeting on SB 497 task force to study repealing motor vehicle property tax. We have some members here and on Zoom. Thank you. Nice to see you all. With that, I would like to ask my co-chair if you have any remarks.
Yeah, thank you, Senator. I'd just like to thank the representatives from CCM and Cost for attending today to provide information to us. I look forward to your presentations, and also thank you to our task force members for volunteering to be part of this. Thank you, Senator.
Thank you. We have some new members today to task force. Our new members, if you are here or could not be at our first meeting, please introduce yourself, start from here and followed by Zoom. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Senator. Representative, good to see you. I'm Ben Florsheim. This is my first meeting. I missed the last one, but I'm glad to be here. I'm proud to serve as the mayor of the city of Middletown, and proud to have been appointed and grateful to have been appointed by Majority Leader Jason Rojas to this committee. As a municipal CEO, and I know we're going to be hearing from CCM and from Cost today. This is something that is front of mind. It's very much front of mind for those of us who just went through an election season, because it is one of the huge. I know I'm preaching to the choir, so I won't make a speech here, but it's a huge factor in there are inequitable cost of living in our communities across the state, and I'm glad to be part of coming up with a solution. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And any members on Zoom, the new members, please introduce yourself.
I'll jump in here, Senator. State Representative Holly Cheeseman. I'm the ranking member of the Finance, Revenue, and Bonding Committee. I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry I couldn't make the first meeting, but I did have a legitimate excuse. I was actually away on my honeymoon, so I hope the task force will forgive me, and I'm delighted to be back and participating.
Good morning. I'm Laura Hoyt. I'm the mayor of Stratford. I've been appointed by Senate Republican leader Kevin Kelly. My congratulations to you, Holly, my former House of Representative colleague. I can't give anything but the best wishes to you as a wonderful person, and I'm excited to be on this task force with you all. Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone else there? Great. Thank you very much. Great to have you all here today with us. We have some great group here to present and provide additional information on car tax in Connecticut. CCM and Cost here today with us. Welcome and thank you for being here. I'd like to ask CCM and Cost, I think they are both a joint presentation today here, asking us and followed by question to our members. Thank you.
Good afternoon or good morning. Thank you for the opportunity to speak. My name is Randy Collins with the Connecticut Conference of Municipality. Joining me is Betsy Guerra.
Thank you. Good morning. Betsy Guerra, Executive Director of the Connecticut Council of Small Towns.
Just in light of trying to keep everything tight, Betsy and I have decided just to kind of pinch hit and do this presentation together. I have provided the slide deck that CCM has presented that can be added to the record, but we'll use costs. Our issues are very intertwined. I don't think there's much differential between them. Obviously, some of the concerns of our bigger cities are might be a little bit different, but overall, I think it's safe to say we agree. The property tax, the motor vehicle tax is very regressive. It is administratively very difficult to collect, but at the same point, we're looking at $1 billion, in excess of $1 billion in municipal revenue. And that if we were to eliminate the motor vehicle tax, how is that $1 billion in revenue made up? I think currently the total grand list for municipalities on property tax is over 400. This is the net grand list is over 415 billion. Of which 67 billion is already exempted by state law. There's over 100 mandated property tax exemptions for state property, college, hospital, university, nonprofit that are exempted. So that sets some communities back significantly. We have numerous communities that have almost 50% of their grand list that is off the books. So of the property tax, which I believe that if you take every town, I think the average is about 60% of all revenue for all of our towns as an average is from the property tax. 65% of that is from residential taxpayers. 18% of that property tax revenue is commercial industrial. 8% is motor vehicles. So that is a significant amount that we would have to look at. And there are 92 towns where over 75% of all their revenue is generated by the property tax. I think the remaining 30% revenue on average is about, comes from intergovernmental or state aid and federal dollars. But that money can be inconsistent, as we've seen. I mean, over the last few years, we've been fortunate with, solid budget years and not looking at deficits. But when those numbers start to dip, that state aid can become a little bit inconsistent, or it can be reduced, really putting municipalities in a burden of how do they make that up. So I think our perspective is, yes, we'd love to get rid of the motor vehicle tax. And I won't take too much time from Betsy, but it's a burden that I don't like having to come up on an annual basis and talk about the car tax. But it's hard to look at that car tax in a vacuum. I think we all agree we need property tax reform, and looking how do we provide relief, not just from the motor vehicle tax, but from the property tax, which is regressive. But we need to look at all those aspects, but to look at just that $1 billion of motor vehicle tax without looking at the broader picture, I think makes it very difficult to address.
Thank you, Randy. As Randy mentioned, Connecticut towns collect approximately 1.047 billion in motor vehicle taxes on more than 3 million cars and trucks. And that's a number that bears repeating, because every year when we testify regarding legislation to either repeal or to modify the car tax, that number keeps going up and up. And for small towns, particularly those towns that don't have a large commercial base, that's a significant source of revenue. And these revenues, as you know, are relied upon by municipalities to fund critical services. So education, public safety, local infrastructure, and those costs keep going up every year due to inflation, due to increases in construction costs and so forth. So we have always been very wary about proposals to either eliminate the car tax or cap the car tax, because without a fail-safe mechanism to fully reimburse municipalities for lost car tax, eliminating the car tax is not a tax cut. It's a tax shift, and shifting over $1 billion in tax burden to homeowners, businesses, and other property owners will undermine the property values, but it'll also trigger increases in rents. It'll trigger increases in the cost of certain goods and services. So we do appreciate that this task force, or that the bill that created the task force, also considered other mechanisms to replace that lost revenue. And that's absolutely critical. But again, it has to be a fail-safe mechanism. We've seen too many times where there have been caps in place or programs designed to reimburse municipalities for lost revenues due to property tax exemptions and other programs. And unfortunately, that funding has always been vulnerable, particularly when the state is facing some very difficult budget years. So currently, the mill rate on car taxes is capped at 32.46. It was first enacted in 2015. I know you understand the reasons, because intended to address some of the disparities where you have a higher tax bill for the same car in one town than you do in the other town. At this point, there are 75 municipalities and 25 special taxing districts that actually receive grants to reimburse them for lost property taxes on motor vehicles. And that totals a little over 132 million. And so that's a sizable amount. That does include an additional 100 million that was specified in the midterm budget adjustment. And I do have to credit Governor Lamont's administration when this was adopted, and the legislative leaders. Cost was very concerned, as CCM was, that this was not going to be a sustainable program, that this was going to be subject to cuts whenever the state ended up having some difficulties. And to their credit, this has always been, they've been committed to ensuring that that the towns do receive their full reimbursement for those lost car tax revenues. But just for some of you who are newer to the committee, just to understand where we've been with some of these state reimbursement programs, over time, we've seen a lot of these programs either be swept or capped or subject to other cuts, including mid-year cuts, because the state was facing difficult budget deficits. So if you look at the payment in lieu of taxes program for state-owned property, it's intended to reimburse municipalities for 45% of lost revenues. Pilot for colleges and hospitals intended to reimburse towns for 77% of lost revenues. Pilot for correctional facilities, 100% of lost revenues. But the funding for these programs has never been fully funded. So those amounts are capped, and the amount that the towns actually receive is prorated. So for fiscal year 23, and now we do this on a tiered basis, municipalities receive 50%, 40%, and 30% of their pilot grants respectively. And in fiscal year 24, the Budget and Implementer Act increases these so that the towns will be receiving 53% under tier 1, 43% under tier 2, and 33% under tier 3. So that's a concern that we're going to eliminate this very easily collected source of revenue on the local level. It's money that's generated on the local level. The towns have control over it. They can rely on the amount that they're going to see every year, and they can dedicate that to funding local programs. So again, we do have concerns about programs that are created to try to reimburse municipalities for that. I don't want to.
I just think, I don't know if we just want to, or I know our slide deck is off. I think it was the one that I submitted, so it might be a little bit confusing. I mean, then bringing it back to the motor vehicle, in 2015, as Betsy said, we enacted the first motor vehicle cap. And that came in, I believe it was 37 mil, my numbers might be off. And then in statute, it had been scheduled, okay, the following year it was going to go to 32, and then it was going to have a gradual decrease. Within a year, though, we had a very long budget year before we finally adopted a state budget, and towns, and we didn't know, are we going to 32 mils? Is it going to be 35? And towns were being asked to set a budget, not knowing what they could tax their motor vehicles at or what they would be reimbursed at. So as we sit there and all of a sudden and we make towns more reliant on state aid because our budget cycles do not coincide, it makes it very difficult for local government. And when that number finally came in, I think it had set at 37 mils, towns had to send out, either they had to eat that delta, that difference of what they had lost, or they had to send out supplemental tax bills and now try to collect on a 2-3 mil difference to make up that difference. So the idea of over-reliance, and a lot of, I'll say, is, we have over-reliance on the property tax, but over-reliance also on state aid can create its own set of problems. So we have seen proposals on a number of different things where we'll send property tax dollars to the state, then it'll be redistributed back. And I think towns are very wary of that, just, unfortunately, given a past history of those things not coming through. The other thought is, one of the things that I know Betsy from Cost and CCM have dealt with as all of you, the issue of affordable housing. A lot of times we ask, why is housing as unaffordable? The property tax is one of a driving reason for the unaffordability of housing throughout the state. And if you were to eliminate that motor vehicle tax, again, where is that without a steady and reliable, replacement for it? That burden is going to shift to our residential and our commercial property. And when we look at that, in some towns, that might not be it might be a couple mil shift up or down, but it also could be disproportionately felt in towns, where you have 10% of your budget is set to motor vehicles. It also could have a disproportionate impact on elderly residents who have downsized to one car, might be 15 years old, not much value, but they've stayed in their house, where all of a sudden they're paying an $80, $90 car tax bill. But if now they're shifting that, a company like Amazon, I see Amazon delivery trucks in my neighborhood constantly. Now, if we eliminate the motor vehicle on that is a big win for, those type of vehicle intensive industries. But your restaurant that doesn't have a motor vehicle to offload, they don't have vehicles associated with their business. They don't have that. They're not going to see a savings. They're just going to see a tax increase on the other side. So as I said, it's something that we have to look at in terms of a holistic view of the property tax. And it's hard to look just at motor vehicles. I know even just looking at how we value motor vehicles has been complicated. And we're looking at, shifting from manufacturers or National Automobile Dealer Association pricing to manufactured suggested retail price with a set depreciation schedule to provide more predictability. But in some of the initial numbers that we saw, it looked almost a 30% reduction in some towns just by shifting how you value that motor vehicle, a 30% reduction in their motor vehicle brand list. And again, that is just going to be shifted to our commercial and residential taxpayers.
Right. So as Randy mentioned, the towns are one of the things that comes up on our legislative surveys each year is that towns want predictable revenue streams. And so we always look at proposals with that in mind. Is this going to create predictability, or is this going to create uncertainty when planning local budgets? And so in my PowerPoint presentation, I do highlight some of the legislation that has been considered in the past relative to the car taxes. And I have to say, if you go back, I mean, there's OLR reports that go back and talk about efforts to eliminate the property tax on motor vehicles back to 1988. And I'm sure before then, it's always been a very unpopular tax. But unfortunately, it has been a workforce, particularly for small towns, again, that don't have a large commercial base. So just in 2022, there were proposals that would reduce the cap on motor vehicles to 30 mils, but the reimbursement to municipalities would have been phased out to just 20% over time. In 2019, there were efforts to repeal the car tax entirely, but also then another proposal to replace the local car tax with a statewide car tax of between 15 and 19 mils, and then use those funds to increase funding for pilot, special education, and other programs, most of which probably would have benefited the cities and alliance districts, but not so much for some of our smaller towns. And then back in 2011, 12, and 13, there were again proposals that would establish a statewide mill rate, but towns would be required to collect those revenues, send them to the state, and then hope that some of those would be redistributed back to the towns. Unfortunately, it was going to be based on some kind of calculation that we weren't able to understand. How is this going to impact revenues in our small towns? And so we've always said that when you're looking at these proposals, you really need to do a full economic cost analysis to determine, is it really helping anybody in the community, or is it just shifting costs around? Because we did have some towns several years ago look at these, and they generated some estimates as to who this would benefit. And not surprisingly, really, it only benefited a handful of residents in the town. Those individuals that may have a high value car but don't own a home. And then it's even hard to gauge whether that's going to be a true benefit, because the rents and the cost of other products and services that businesses and property owners end up having to pay because they're paying more property taxes on their buildings and homes, whether those would end up increasing over time. So again, there weren't a lot of winners when you eliminated the car tax, but there were, people that were concerned that it was going to shift more of the costs to those homeowners and small businesses that are really bearing the brunt of the property tax burden at this time. So we've always talked about you need a fail-safe mechanism. And what do we mean by that? One of our town leaders has recommended that if they're going to do something relative to eliminating or further capping the car tax, that they need to authorize towns to increase their mill rates if reimbursement grants are cut or eliminated. And I know we've been in very good fiscal times for the last several years. I know there's a report that was out earlier today indicating that, there was an article in the Connecticut Mirror questioning, as the time of big budget surplus is over. And I think fortunately, because of the spending and the volatility caps, Connecticut is in a very good position budget wise. But it wasn't that long ago in 2017 where we had protracted budget debates, and they were looking at mid-year cuts to municipal aid that would have wreaked havoc with our communities. So, there's a big concern there. The other suggestion is that you could include a provision in statute that automatically removes or adjusts the car tax cap if funds aren't made available to fully reimburse municipalities. Because right now we're kind of subject at the mercy of the state budget process. And as you know, that doesn't end up being finalized until very late in the game, after local budgets have already been adopted. So that's something to think about. The other thing I want to point out, because I heard at the first meeting that people talk about, well, what a pain in the neck it is to collect the car tax. There is data. You can go to OPM's municipal fiscal indicators, and they look at collection rates. And for small towns in particular, the collection rates are between 97 and 98%, which is considered average to good, or 98 to 99%, which is considered excellent. So they're not seeing that it's really difficult to collect the car tax. The other issue that's been raised is that it's a pain in the neck to assess those values. And right now it's currently based on the National Automobile Dealers Association appraisal guide that OPM has a schedule that they release, but that's changing. So under a new law effective October 1st, 2024, assessors will be valuing those motor vehicles based on the manufacturer's suggested retail price. And this is supposed to really streamline and simplify the process for assessors. So we'll see how that plays out. There's some other discussions ongoing regarding that, but it's certainly something to think about.
I think one of the things that, again, no one disagrees with the car tax is regressive, and we'd love to be able to come to grips with it. I was 2017, CCM put out a report. We titled this report is different. And we looked at comprehensive property tax reform and kind of looked at 3 different tiers of it. We were going to go forward with reforming the property tax system. We really identified, 3 areas, and we needed, there had to be mandate relief. So revenue diversification, reducing municipal reliance on property taxes. Their mandate relief needed to come through, looking at ways to maximize, intergovernmental savings. Are there better ways to share services so we're not replicating 169 public works departments, police departments, fire departments? And so it's like mandate relief, intergovernmental savings, and local revenue diversification. So these are some of the things that, again, that we have to address if we're going to look at and really make meaningful car tax relief or property tax relief. But again, I think it's, as we move more and more towards encouraging transit-oriented development, use of public transportation, especially in our urban areas where there's a lot of people who don't own cars. Again, if we shift that burden from the car tax to, residential commercial property, people, again, who rent, own homes are going to see an increase, and they're not going to see a corresponding savings. So these are considerations, and I think it's why Betsy said, we can go back as far as OLR reports go of how do we eliminate the car tax? It's probably been a burden as long as we've been here, but it has to be done holistically to make sure that we're not just shifting that burden. And I think that that's the most important thing. Economic development, our companies that are coming in, one of the most discouraging aspects for them coming into the state is the property tax. As soon as they purchase a piece of property, they're in the red. They haven't produced a line of code. They haven't made one widget. They haven't sold anything, but they're already behind. And that is very difficult for a lot of companies as they're looking to relocate here. Because again, they're already going to be catching up. So, it has to be done, as I kind of keep reiterating, it has to be done holistically, and we have to, and a lot of the solutions are probably not politically popular at the state level or the local level. I mean, we have to look at the tax exemptions that are provided. Just because you're a senior or a veteran like myself doesn't mean I don't have an ability to pay for some of those exemptions that are provided. But again, those are, I think we have a new tax incident study that's coming soon, but
Right.
I believe the last time that we had that study, one of the parameters was it had to be revenue neutral. If it's revenue neutral, we're just simply shifting the deck chairs and not really addressing that burden that our residents are facing. And again, going back why the property taxes is regressive. With an income tax, if you lose your job, unfortunately, or if you have a bad year, you're going to pay less. But we saw during COVID, we told businesses they had to shut down. We told restaurants, nope, you can't open on an unlimited basis. Your property tax bill didn't adjust. And why that in one sense presents a benefit to municipalities, because it does provide stability and predictability in terms of revenue, but you can see how hard that is for companies. I'm not being allowed to operate. I can't open my restaurant. I can't seat people. I can't, have people in. Well, here's your bill. And it doesn't address different economic considerations as we go forward.
One of the issues that I do want to raise, since you're looking at car taxes, is the antique vehicle issue. So tax assessments on antique cars are currently capped at $500. And under current law, antique vehicles are defined as any vehicle over 20 years old, preserved because of historical significance. So you don't have to have an antique license plate, and altered from the original production of the vehicle. And we have in some communities, people collect antique vehicles that are luxury collectibles, and they're worth thousands and thousands of dollars. And yet they, again, are only subject to that $500 assessment cap, which is, very inequitable for those other people that are paying taxes. So would urge you to consider looking at that. And as Randy mentioned, really need to look at car tax relief in the context of overall property tax reform. It's something I know CCM's been a leader on looking at some recommendations for that, and COST has certainly been supportive of those efforts. So I know it's beyond the scope of this task force, but certainly something that needs to be under consideration. And again, we do appreciate that the underlying bill did look at whether or not there are other mechanisms for replacing that lost revenue. I don't have any data on that, but I would just urge you, if you are looking at other mechanisms, to, again, do that cost benefit analysis, ensure that those other mechanisms are sustainable, and determine what the impact of those mechanisms are on other costs. So for example, if it's an insurance surcharge, how is that going to impact auto insurance rates? And if it's a landlord licensing fee, what is that going to do to our rental housing market? So again,
And I'll just add one other, thinking about motor vehicles on a broader scale. One of the other issues that we are trying to address, proliferation of out-of-state plates. As we have now that 32.46 cap, motor vehicle cap, that has reduced a lot of people registering their vehicle in a different town within the state, because, it's gone from, I think, before the first cap went in, now you saw, mill rates in the 60s when it came to 45. Now it's down to 32. I believe the state mill rate average is probably about 28 or 29. So there's a little bit of variance where you can start to maybe save by keeping it at my parents' house, or, or moving it here. What we're seeing that reduce because that cap is much closer than it had been. But when you can register your vehicle out of state, this is especially problematic. And we saw during COVID, we saw a large influx of people moving into the state, especially into Waterbury, some of the Fairfield County areas where people also, if they rent and don't own, that motor vehicle tax might be the only bill that they are paying to that town. So when you have the students are now, if they have kids, their children are going to local schools. If we can't capture those vehicles that are out of state and not properly paying the taxes, again, it is putting that burden onto other residents to have to carry those costs. And there's some states I know, like I think it's Maine, where you could go online, register your car with get it shipped, a Maine license plate. You can actually have a Connecticut address put onto that. So it is something that we've been looking at, trying to work with DMV to help local officials identify and properly tax those cars that are out of state, to make sure everyone is, paying the share that we're allowed to charge. So another issue to look at as we go forward. I think we can take questions. We can go on.
Sure.
All day. I think we've been doing this for years.
Thank you so very much. And members, you have any question for our CCM and cost?
Yes, Senator, may I jump in here? Representative Cheeseman? a
So-
couple.
Cheeseman and followed by you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Couple of questions for both of you. You mentioned the need should the state end the car tax or your ability to have the car tax, some mechanism that should state reimbursement not be, be cut, fall behind, that you would be allowed to reinstate it. From a technical point of view, how easy do you think that would be to suddenly revive the car tax again after a hiatus? That's question one.
It could be very difficult on the local level. I mean, certainly if the town decides to adjust the mill rate on motor vehicles because the lack of reimbursement, I think it's not going to be very politically popular. However, if they find that they need to do that to address any potential budget shortfall due to the lack of funds for reimbursement, at least it's a mechanism that's available to them.
I think if the motor vehicle tax would be eliminated, bringing it back would be very problematic. I think it would be difficult to increase that mill rate because no one wants to see a higher tax bill. But I think if you went from not having a tax or assuming that there's going to be a tax on this to getting a new bill that you weren't anticipating, I think, and I defer to our local leaders that are here, of trying to reinstitute a new tax is much harder than just maintaining taxes where they are, or even with a slight increase. So I think it would be more likely you would see towns, you eliminate the motor vehicle tax, and then based on reimbursement from the state, it wasn't there. I think it'd be politically and probably technically easier just to increase that commercial residential property tax.
Right. So you would just bump up the general mill rate and not worry about, which in effect is again passing the cost on to everybody else.
It would position them, however, in the next fiscal year to adjust it in a way, rather than having to wait for the legislature and just try to figure out if they were going to actually fund the program again.
Okay. And as you mentioned, I share your concern that if the state makes a commitment, is there a guarantee that we'll keep that commitment in perpetuity? And my second question, you mentioned that, the different options you presented, if we looked holistically at eliminating the property tax, and I think the final one you referenced was revenue diversification for the towns and municipalities. Can you give us some examples of how you see that playing out?
So the way CCM had looked at it, and we looked at it, I don't think a local income tax was very practical. I don't think the idea of creating, you have an entire state agency, DRS, dedicated to collecting a state income tax, and I think it would be very hard of, do I collect it where it's generated? Do I collect it where a resident lives? But if we started looking at sales tax revenue, hotel, and I know that there's a portion now that is sent back to municipalities. So there are ways, and I think the way CCM, and we had probably about a 20-member panel that represented a lot of municipalities, that looked at if we did increase that sales tax to still remain competitive with, our neighboring states, and that the money would be distributed kind of on a 60-40 split. We had looked at, I believe, TAR and LoSIP, or two different formulas as a way to kind of weight that distribution back out, because you adjusted sales tax revenue, there'd be a lot of municipalities that have very limited sales tax base. There's also a lot of, if you have chain restaurants where they're going to collect at one point based on credit card. So there are ways to do it. But the other thing that we'd also looked at was, by revenue diversification, how do we make sure that that money actually goes towards reducing the property tax? We, instead of just, hey, look, there's more money, now we can just continue to go forward. But so that's why there's some of those aspects of cost containment features that need to be put in there as we go forward and looking at, so that maybe this new revenue is not looked at in terms of like the bargaining purposes, so that we can keep costs down rather than just, oh, look at your ability to pay, we can go forward. So how do we, if you diversified local revenue, how do we ensure that that actually translate to property tax reductions? So as I said, they're really complicated issues as we go forward, but and I know other people have talked about property tax caps, look at Massachusetts, but and there's a lot of different aspects that go into play, and what Massachusetts took to pass their property tax cap, I think it was in 1980, and it's worked fairly well. up until now, or at least through now. Check your mass and why.
All right, thank you. Thank you for your answers and thank you, Senator.
Thank you, Mr. Harrington.
Yes, thank you. I guess questions and statements. You brought up the collection rate of the motor vehicle tax being in 98, 99%. One of the things in which as a town, as a municipality, we enjoy is that in order for somebody to register their vehicle, their taxes need to be paid. With the state changing to a 3-year registration, it will be interesting to see where those collection rates go. But ultimately, I think we'll see the collection rate continue in order to get that vehicle registered. Where unfortunately, when you look at, real estate taxes, I think every municipality out there will tell you there are some individuals that, haven't paid their property tax in 10 years. And there are options, and our town being one of them are looking at options. But the one thing about the motor vehicle tax is that's almost a guarantee, or we're going to have a whole bunch of cars unregistered in the state of Connecticut. This debate's, really looking at two different things. Do we have a tax that's regressive, or do we have a tax that's, really unfair? And the argument came up at our last meeting, a 2020 Honda Accord would be $300 in Greenwich and be $600 in Hartford. And that is unfair because it still drives the same roads. And perhaps another way of looking at it, probably jumping the gun here, but I'm going to throw it out there just for discussion, or so we can think about it. As the state drives the mill rate down in the cap, more towns are going to qualify for a reimbursement. And then again, not making, the fund being able to continue. You were at 37, now you're at, was it 32.46? I did take notes, 32.46. So you're driving that mill rate down, and you're actually getting more towns, which is then going to put the state back on its heels even more, as more towns will qualify for reimbursement. Maybe the other way to look at it and shifting it is look at the car, look at the rate, and I'm going to throw an example out. Maybe the rate's 25, statewide 25 is the mill. Now this town of Greenwich, their mill rate, I believe, is lower than 25. You're going to shift some of that off of the businesses, in fact, maybe doing the opposite effect of lowering rents, for people that may own, multifamilies or apartment complexes. Those mill rates would drop in those particular towns. But everyone would be on an equal playing field. So the argument of that 2020 Honda Accord, no matter where you park it, it's $300. Flip side, something that we've done, put it out there publicly, is we've actually gone out to several states, and we've actually worked with their assessors, and we've asked them, can you send us a list of all the motor vehicle taxes that are registered in your state, but you're mailing it to our town? Then we go out and have a little fun with that. But there are ways around it. There's obviously investigation, but yeah, we're going to fight for every dollar that we can as a municipality. But again, it's close to $1.1 billion.
That doesn't count supplemental motor vehicles.
And that doesn't, so we're probably at 1.2 million with supplemental, or if that. It's no secret why I'm here and why I'm going to fight strong for keeping that taxes. 10% of our budget in Windsor Locks is made up of the rental cars up at the airport. There's very little benefit that we get off of the airport. We don't get a hotel tax. We get a lot of, crime. We get a lot of use of our roads as people are coming into that airport. We need that $5 million just to maintain our infrastructure out there. So just some comments. I enjoyed your presentation. Thank you. It was full of facts, which I love, and made things make me think even harder. So I appreciate you coming in today. Thank you.
Thanks. I do want to clarify, however, that the collection rates were for overall property tax collection, not just motor vehicle. I couldn't find them parceled out.
Excellent point. And I don't think as a municipality, we, you look at total taxes, and I don't think we do it separately, but I wanted to touch the fact that, we're confident in being able to collect our, and the interesting part is that's when you see the most cash in municipalities is the person that needs the clearance that they paid their tax. And if they write a check, we have to wait for that check to clear. That's actually the days that we receive the most cash in town hall is that they want it cleared that day. And since we have the cash, the tax collector will give them the clear so they can register.
And I think one of the things, I mean, Greenwich always comes up as that perfect example of, I think their mill rate's about 12 or 13, but I think that's a perception that it's only rich people in Greenwich, but there are people who are, working poor that do live in Greenwich that have been there for a long time or elderly on fixed incomes. And that's true of every municipality. So if you're at that 13 mil, you pay, that 13 mil rate. And if we jump them to that statewide average, 25, 28, that's going to be an increase for some of those. For some people, it'll be and some people in Greenwich, they buy cars, they don't care about what the car tax is. Like they're buying $100,000 cars, and when you buy a $100,000 car, you're probably not overly concerned with the car tax. But there also could be commercial vehicles that have a high value. And all of a sudden you jump that motor vehicle tax on a guy with a landscaping truck, a $75,000 pickup truck that he uses for his business. But one of the things that I know that we had looked at initially when we were looking at changing that NADA to that MSRP with a depreciation schedule was trying to do a better job to link that commercial motor vehicle to the business. Because like you said, you can't, if you don't pay your car taxes, or you don't pay your property taxes, you can't register your vehicle. Now, if you're not paying your personal property taxes on that business and the vehicle's not necessarily linked to it, you're still allowed to register that landscaping truck or that delivery truck. Are we making that connection and tying that same restriction to commercial and residential or personal vehicles? So that's something else that we should make sure we're looking at.
Thank you for the presentation. Very informative. I guess I could see why the towns would be wary of not receiving revenue from the state, and I haven't been here that long, but I hear it quite often from municipal leaders that, well, the state is always shortchanging us or making promises we don't keep. So I am empathetic to that. I guess one question I had for you, the current mill cap we have now on the motor vehicle tax, you said the towns that qualify receive a grant for that. Is that grant out of a dedicated fund, or does that just come out of the general fund? Do you know?
That money comes out of, a portion comes out of the municipal revenue share. I think it now falls under the municipal revenue sharing fund. I know we kind of shuffled the deck chairs a little bit in terms of how municipal aid is put out. A portion of which is, I think 0.05% of the sales tax goes into that municipal revenue sharing fund. The rest is a general fund appropriation to meet that obligation. So I think pilot falls under there, the motor vehicle reimbursement. And there's a few other different, state, municipal aid. I mean, municipal aid is almost $3 billion.
And it is spelled out in the budget that the town by town allocations are actually part of the budget. So the good news is that you as a legislator can look to make sure that your municipality is receiving what they were anticipating receiving. And I think that's been very helpful in terms of making sure that that those funds haven't been cut. But as Paul pointed out, now we started with, I think, a dozen towns that were eligible for the reimbursement grant. Now we're up to 75 as they continue to move the mill rate cap lower. So it is something to be wary about. And, again, we've been in really good fiscal times, and that's, I think, to the credit of the administration and the lawmakers. But we're, got to be mindful of the fact that times change, and we need to make sure that our towns aren't going to be facing some fiscal uncertainty as a result of that.
I think, yes, and I would kind of look at this in the sense that with that 32.46 mill rate cap, and it was set at 32.46, that was $100 million. So that is why we have kind of that bizarre, like, why not just 32? Why not 33? But while it reduced the burden for residents on that actual car tax bill of what they were paying, the tax on that car didn't change. It's just now I'm paying 32.46 on my car, and I'm just funding the rest of it through my income tax, my sales taxes, and other fees that are charged. We didn't actually reduce that tax burden. It just shifted where that's being paid. As I said, that's why as we look at, eliminating the motor vehicle tax or doing this, are we doing it where we're just increasing a different tax? Are we actually finding a way to really dig down and say, how do we actually provide property tax reform and relief so that residents are paying less of their money into these taxes, and not just, again, I'm taking it from motor vehicle and I'm going to put it in your income and sales tax. Again, it looks nice when I get that separate bill that's a little bit less, but overall, I'm still going to be paying that same burden as a resident.
I have a question.
You could go ahead.
Wonderful presentation. I am actually a resident and a small business owner, and I'm a dentist actually by profession, and I have owned real estate and small businesses. So one of the things that I see, that one of the problem as a resident that we see when the legislator makes all these rules and taxations and tax waiver, one of the problem is that we always see that the taxes cut in one side and added to the other side. So there is a lot of unhappy ending with that. So keeping that in mind, I just have some food for thought that I came up with. And I was asking that why is it not possible to, instead of based on the mill rate, just base the taxes, excise tax, or name it as excise tax, or under state on the valuation of the car, let's say Toyota Corolla, $10,000, based on that, the tax is calculated. So that way, that same car, if it's in the Fairfield County, pays the same taxes. If it's in Norwich, which is a much more, taxes that the individual is paying. So why is it so difficult on that? That's one of the questions I have. And what are the technical limitation if something can be done like that? Rhode Island actually has eliminated car property tax also. They took a couple of years. And why can't we create a time or a few years of sort of like a learning process for us to determine how the tax changes will impact in the collection side, and the fear of town, losing all the funding and having a budget crisis. So can we create a time frame like Rhode Island did? It took a couple of years, but they finally eliminated their car property tax. So it's sort of like I know the question is a little confusing, but I hope that you understood that.
Well, I mean, I can start. I mean, if we're eliminating the car tax, I mean, one of the things that from the CCM side is we're looking at, revenue diversification. And if we just, without that revenue diversification, and if we just eliminate that car tax, even if we spread it out over a few years, we're further reducing the property, the revenue base for our municipalities. And now we're going to be wholly reliant on residential and commercial property. And if there's a reduction in state aid, we will hit bad economic times. It's a cycle, not that any of us want to see. We've been fortunate, but so if we do see a reduction in state aid, we do see a reduction in education aid, because we have minimum budget requirements. Towns are required to fund at a certain level. How do we meet that mandated cost? And right now I have commercial, I have residential, I have personal property, I have motor vehicle. If I eliminate one of those, it's just pushing more onto that commercial residential. I know other states use, an excise tax, so it's a higher tax when you purchase that vehicle. But again, one of the concerns that we have as municipalities, that's collected by the state, and now we have to hope that money actually comes back to where it goes. And would that have what level of, when you think I had that car for 10 years, what level of excise tax would I have to put on it to offset an annual property tax as an upfront cost? And then when I buy that tax, I might be living in one town and I move the next year, or the next month. How do you make sure that money is getting to to pay for roads, police, fire, schools, all those different things that our residents, one, that they expect, they deserve. So there has to, as you said, they're very complicated issues. You ask every single person out there, do you want to get rid of your car tax? Absolutely. I don't think anyone wants, yeah, I want to pay that. Are you willing to pay more on your sales tax for grocery, whatever it may be? Oh, I don't want to do that. So it really is a balance of how do we move forward, and how do we get away from a very regressive property tax, which I think is one of the biggest hindrances towards homeownership, affordability of housing, economic development. It's one of the things that we have to look at if we want to move our state forward.
And I think you also need to look at the number of property tax exemptions that are already on the books. And I know you guys have this number because you're always throwing it out there. Is it?
I think at this point, I think there's 100 mandated property tax exemptions.
Right.
And then
yeah.
there's.
And that just ends up shifting more of the burden really to that middle-class homeowner that is struggling right now. And so you've got to be careful. Is eliminating the car tax going to help them? Are these, or is it, or who is it intended to help? Because it's probably going to just shift the greater burden to that middle-class homeowner, and they're not going to see a lot of benefit because they may not have higher end cars that they're paying the property taxes on. So again, economic analysis would be really helpful. And I know the Office of Fiscal Analysis does a great job, but unfortunately during the legislative process, we don't always have an opportunity to take a long look at some of those costs and benefits. And so I am glad that you're having this task force, because I think it gives you a forum for really deliberating and thinking about ways to approach this rather than throwing something out in the legislative session and then we react in a way that, you know, is kind of typical right now, that we're very concerned about what the impact is going to be on our ability to deliver services on the local level.
And I think for our mayors, I mean, one of the things I often will tell legislators during the session of, you know, CCM's kind of knee-jerk reaction. If our membership doesn't understand what the impact is going to be, they're going to have a tendency to, I'm going to say no, and we can look at it, you know, until we fully understand what that impact is. So a lot of times, I mean, this is good that we have a longer time, and we have a short session coming up, and we see a lot of proposals, and it you know, makes us, well, unfortunately, we're the land of steady habits. At times, I mean, sometimes it's good, other times it doesn't work.
Can I ask a question?
Sure, please proceed.
First of all, great presentation, but it was actually very difficult to hear, especially from the gentleman's side. Now, it was one of your slides that actually shows the property tax burden, and compared to rest of the United States, which is about 1,700, residents of Connecticut, they're already paying an average of 3,000. They're already being penalized. So when you actually talk about cost-benefit analysis and so on, I mean, the cost-benefit analysis is already against the middle-income people in the state of Connecticut. So the question then is, when you are talking about getting rid of motor vehicles and so on, I mean, my understanding is the cost-benefit analysis should actually reduce the overall tax burden for the residents of the state of Connecticut. But we all kept on arguing that actually, definitely there's going to be a shift in tax burden and so on and so forth. But I would like to see something that is what I call a tangible decrease in the total amount of taxes that our citizens are actually paying. And this to me, I mean, it doesn't make any sense, because we know they're getting penalized, but we are actually not talking about how do we actually make it happen. So I would like to hear your take on it.
Our case on how do we reduce the overall tax burden, probably a little beyond our mission to do that, but I agree. I mean, that's something that our residents mention to their local leaders all the time, is that it's a very high tax cost state. And I think one of the ways you do that is to control spending on the local level. And as Randy pointed out earlier, towns are really limited in how they can control spending. So we have in this state a minimum budget requirement, the MBR, which requires the municipality to spend as much, if not more, than they did in the previous fiscal year. there are some
On education.
and educations, thank you. There are some ways that towns can say, well, we saved money because we had some reductions in personnel, or maybe we had some regional efficiency that we were able to take advantage of. But by and large, it's very hard to do that, to get the State Department of Education to approve an exception to the MBR. And we know why it's in place, but it is leaving towns with a lot of difficulty in terms of controlling education costs. And for small towns in particular, the education budget is the biggest cost driver on the local level. So I think you need to look at those things. I think you need to look at special education costs, which is clearly important, but something that is really increasing every year and creating some disparities in special education, the quality of special education and delivery of special education on a town by town basis. So there's a lot you can do, but I think it may be beyond the scope of this particular task force, but we're happy to have a larger discussion about that.
I think one of the other things that we need to look at is that, we'll put out ACIR, the Advisory Council on Intergovernmental Affairs, which is legislative and OPM driven. I think they identify 1,300 unfunded or underfunded state mandates. One of the things that Massachusetts did when they did their property tax cap, they actually put into law that they need a 2/3 vote of the legislature before to vote for an unfunded state mandate on municipalities. They have to vote separately, then they vote on that unfunded mandate, that bill that's being shipped to towns. So it really makes it legislators kind of, okay, this is actually what is this impact going to be on my town? Yes, we know we're not providing the funding for it, but we think it's important. So there's a mechanism to do it. But we see a lot, in these small property tax exemptions, small mandates, and quite often it's just a small mandate or it's just a small exemption. But when you look at 100 property tax exemptions or 1,300 unfunded state mandates, that really creates that burden. It really restricts what, municipalities can do. I had a friend a few years back became the mayor and he ran on property tax relief. I said, if you just hold the bill flat, that I think your residents would be very happy. And then you can start to look at where you can save. But he quickly realized that there wasn't a lot of fat on that budget of where they can reduce. And I think that's a frustration of local residents, local leaders. I know it's a frustration with every program that's voted on in the legislature came out of a good intent and had, well-intended, good meaning. And that was somebody's idea. And it's very hard to get those back off the books. But, we look at other states, other states have different structures. I mean, I meet with my national counterparts and, well, how do you work with county government? We don't have county government. How do you deal with unincorporated? We don't have unincorporated. And it's because we don't have that county government structure. We don't have that revenue diversification. We do have an over-reliance on that property tax. So that's why it's so disproportionate when you look at Connecticut versus others. Not saying I want county government.
And we have been, by the way, supportive of efforts to encourage the regional delivery of services where it makes sense, where it's going to achieve cost savings and not diminish quality. So those are things too that we need to consider on a larger basis.
That's that cost containment. I mean, that burden has to fall to local government as well as state government in terms of where can we find those savings to provide services, yet reduce the cost, reduce the redundancy of, 169 unique ways of doing things. But, people get very nervous. It's my town and I want control. And, as I said, Middletown or Windsor Lock said, hey, I'm going to share this, or my kids are going to go, people go crazy. Like, no, I moved to this town because I want this. I want a greater say. And it's very difficult political conversations to have.
That's why I say where it makes sense.
Thank you. Mayor Florsheim, please.
Thank you, Senator. I want to say just really thank you both for that presentation and for your answers, and also to my municipal colleagues for their questions. I think that this really has captured in many, many ways, and hopefully will continue to, the catch-22 that we all face here, the equity issue and the reliability of revenue issue. And I totally agree that it needs to be tied to comprehensive reform. I agree that comprehensive reform rests on that sort of three-legged stool in the CCM report. The question that I'm sitting here and asking myself, and I think the question for in this committee and for the state and the municipalities and for CCM and cost more generally is, what is the first thread that we can start pulling on, or the first threads that we can start pulling on, and I wonder if you just have thoughts on that. I think that I think again, it's hard to know where to begin, and I think that is partially what leads to for instance, exemptions being passed, because it seems like a relatively small impact thing that then collectively becomes a larger impact. I'm intrigued by the notion of the supermajority requirement, but I also think, that revenue diversification item is really a big part of it, and whether there isn't, I wonder if there's a conversation to be had about creating those new revenue opportunities, creating the hotel tax, for instance, a sales tax that municipalities can start to phase in and implement and experiment with, and see what the revenue picture looks like before taking dramatic action, and seeing how those savings maybe can be phased in across a municipal budget. I think that, to your point, we do need that flexibility, but we also know better than anybody, I think, the inequitable nature of how it falls on our residents. So increasing those revenue collection opportunities, I think, will help to establish trust among municipalities and trust among their residents that this is about equity, and that we are, when we're trying to spend more on something, it's because we are trying to realize savings elsewhere. And another revenue diversification option is continue to move in the direction of fully funding pilot and restructuring ECS. Right, that is revenue that we it was revenue diversification in our experience when those figures started to change in Middletown. It was in a very favorable direction with tiered pilot a couple of years ago, and that's revenue now that we can count on, that we never could count on before. And of course, it's mentioned in the presentation. It's going to bear mentioning, I think, throughout that it remains to be fully funded, and that is a revenue source that if towns could more reliably depend on, it's savings that we could pass along to residents in the form of property taxes, including on motor vehicle taxes. So I think that keeping this, the equity question really is the question here, and so it's not. I don't think it can be a conversation of how do we go from a car tax to no car tax in the course of a task force work or a budget session, but I think that the comprehensive look makes sense, and I'm glad that we're moving in that direction. So I think there was a question in there somewhere.
With the creation of tiered pilot, definitely moved us in the right direction. And, as Betsy laid out those tiers, and that was something at CCM, and we had a lot of our members that weren't going to see an extra dollar. A lot of our towns, but they were fully supportive because they knew that it was the right thing to do, that our urban areas particularly are facing a disproportionate share of tax, from the tax exempt property services that are provided. A lot of the social service safety net are anchored, or are located in our urban areas. But the whole idea, yes, we are 169 towns and cities, but we're too small of a state to think, oh, I can let the cities go and I'll be okay. Everybody is interconnected and interdependent on one another. So we as a state have to look at, we strengthen our cities, that will help our suburbs, that'll help our rural communities on the outside. We're too small of a state to think, well, I can let one, if they do well, if I do well, I don't care if they don't do well. And I don't think that that's where, I know that's not where CCM members are. I know it's not where cost members are. And I think one of the issues when we did the new motor vehicle cap was it's $100 million was the number that finally was settled on. A lot of members said, well, why don't we just use this to meet the promises that have already been made but not kept before we start creating new programs. But we've continued to work on pilot. I know we got an extra the legislature voted an additional 3% increase in pilot reimbursement. So I think the idea that we're going to fully fund pilot in a year is unrealistic, probably not sustainable. But if we continue like we did with education, it was a 10-year phase and to get to where we need to go on education funding. I think we just need to make that steady progress on those pilot exemption payments, will go a long way to at least holding the burden at the property tax level. And then once we fully fund those, can we start looking at how do we reduce the mill rate for everybody?
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And I think, we often neglect to give the legislature credit for the fact that it is moving the needle on funding some of these municipal programs. It has increased education funding, has increased pilot funding. It increased funding for the local capital improvement program. Town Aid Road funding has been steady. It's increased brownfields funding. It's also increased local bridge funding for the local bridge program. So, that has done a lot to reduce the pressure on municipalities relative to property taxes. And they have by and large been able to hold the line on property tax increases. So, as Randy mentioned, we need to continue to do that because that's going to provide towns with the flexibility to reduce or to at least consider ways of reducing the property tax burden on its residents and businesses.
Thank you. Mr. Commissioner, please, floor on you, please.
Thank you, everybody. Appreciate this meeting. And Randy and Betsy, thank you for coming in. We appreciate your thoughts. I think that just to pull back to the original question, and we're a couple of speakers in, so I just want to sort of respond to that. One of the challenges that we have, and I'm putting my mayor hat back on, and I think that I can speak for the mayors that are on here in this sense, is that every year, whether you like it or not, your base cost of running the government rises anywhere from 3 to 4, even to 5%. That's your built-in GWI, your general wage increases. That's not counting, by the way, your insurance increases. It's not counting all the other stuff that has to be paid for. It's not counting for your post-employee benefits, your OPEB contributions, all the other things you have to make. No matter what you do, that number to run the same government with the same amount of teachers, police officers, firefighters, it goes up about 3 to say 5%, depending on the year and all the mitigating factors that are there. So all of these things are tied in together, and I think that one of the things I've heard from here is that if we did do something, if the legislature did do something about this issue, that it really should be tied to providing direct relief to the taxpayers, right? I mean, in other words, if you eliminate the motor vehicle tax, but now I'm just paying more on my house, well, that doesn't really do anything for our tax incidents. It doesn't really do anything for for really making a regressive tax even more regressive is really what we're doing. So I don't know if that's really what we want to do. So there's been discussion about a comprehensive approach, which is really good. If you did a property tax cap, and then you had a hard cap there that would require 2/3 vote by the legislature, that would be great. But you have to have, I think, the political will in the legislature to do that. And I don't see the political will in the legislature to do that right now. But just understand that before even inflation, you have an increase in your cost of providing services to your residents. Why is that? One is that every time you negotiate a new contract, the salaries always go up. They never go down. I've never seen a municipal contract where the salaries go down. I'm not saying I want them to go down. I'm just trying to tell you what the practical realities of what our folks in the mayor's offices and first selectman offices do. Maybe you go to arbitration. You say, well, we're going to arbitrate this because we're not going to give a 7% increase. And so then you go to arbitration and you listen for 3 months and you spend $150,000 and you come back and, well, you only have to give up a 3.5% raise instead of a 7% raise, and you think you won, but you really didn't win because now that goes to your bottom line. Even when I was mayor, our teachers, I think a very modest raise of 2.5% cost us about $3.5 million. So I just trying to explain what drives a lot of our mayors and first selectmen to be very wary of any program that will reduce a revenue stream to them because they're already really stressed about trying to pay the bills next year. The only other thing I want to point out to everybody, and I think Randy and Betsy would agree, is that while in many cases the mill rates have even gone down in Connecticut, because mayors have been really good about controlling costs, the valuations have gone up because we're in every year somebody somewhere is getting a reval going. And you can never lower the mill rate to equal exactly what the amount of the valuation increase is. Why? Because the revals are based by categories. So you have apartments, condos, houses. Each one has a different valuation. So you may be able to get your apartments to see a pretty much flat tax, but then your houses get whacked because they didn't go up or down as much. So it's like playing whack-a-mole with all these different categories. It's really difficult to do. So our taxpayers did see, it depends on the area, not everybody, but a lot of folks did see an increase, not because the mill rate going up, but the valuations went up dramatically. And that's what happened really with our motor vehicles, right? We put the cap in. I was like, it's going to be great. Everybody's going to be really happy. And they're not happy because then the valuation of the used car market went sky high. And so people actually ended up paying more, even with the cap on. So these are some things that I think we have to look forward and think about as we move forward. But I would just say that it comes down to this. If you're going to end the motor vehicle tax, you got to replace the revenue for the municipalities. If you're going to do that, you got to have our mayors and first selectmen have to have confidence that that money is going to show up every year, that it won't be intercepted, that it won't be turned into something else, that it won't be fully funded, or somebody to figure out a way to go around the statute and put in another statute that will allow the folks to get at that money. And then finally, it has to be used to reduce the overall property tax burden. Because if you're just shifting money around from a car to a house, what are we doing here? You're still, folks are still being stressed by the property tax, which is, as you'll see in our tax incident study, which is alluded to here, coming out next month, is the most regressive tax we have here in the state of Connecticut. Okay, I'm done. I feel better. I don't even know if there's a question there, but I just had to say that.
Well, thank you, Commissioner. That's why it's so helpful to have people in office that are have municipal experience, because they can really frame these concerns in a nutshell. So there you have it, former Mayor of Danbury.
And that 2017 report that CCM had put out was under Mayor Boughton. That Mayor Boughton was the president of CCM at the time, and that was one of the things that he had looked at of how do we look at this comprehensively. Mayor Boughton, thank you. Commissioner Boughton, thank you, because I still refer back to that report quite often as I make my rounds up here.
Thank you. Dr. Khan, please.
Yes, I just have a quick question, or sort of like a food for thought. How about the new source of revenue exploration? Is it on the table for that? And just for an example, let me share that with you. Baltimore, city of Baltimore, I believe it's generated $84 million revenue from just speed violation automated ticketing system. And I was looking at the data, and it looks like if in Connecticut there is about 1,054 schools and schools and colleges, and if you multiply with the 2 or 3 of them, it's almost 3,000 to 4,000 that ticket center we can establish, which is automated, so we don't have to man it. It automatically will issue tickets if somebody is violating the speed, and that will generate a significant amount of revenue, and also it will make Connecticut safer. And as if you recall, a Yale medical student was killed crossing the pedestrian crosswalk a few years ago. Just a Conn College student was crossing, and he was hit and was killed. So there's a lot of fatalities in state of Connecticut, and also there is not just the fatalities. Also, if you look at the loss of property, and you cannot put a value on a price of a human life. So, is there any option for that, and in any kind of new source of revenue instead of moving around the tax?
Well, I mean, this year we passed automated traffic enforcement. I think is more commonly known red light cameras, which will have municipalities will have the option to install those. One of the key things, though, that we stressed, because this was a public safety issue, a pedestrian issue, municipalities get a very small portion of tickets. The revenue from motor vehicle infractions, very small portion comes back to the municipality. We did not ask for a larger portion of that because we didn't want the idea of punishing people. We don't want to incentivize punishing people to generate revenue. And I think that was one of the main concerns of the legislature as they enacted that. So we wanted to increase safety, but not at the expense. So there wasn't a push this isn't a revenue grab. So I think we're very hesitant about, creating new laws or expanding laws to bring money back to towns. I don't think that's where our municipal leaders want to go. But, one of the things we can look at, we look at other revenue sources, look at the Mashantucket Pequot Fund, and how that was designed. And over the years, that money has been reduced on what was given to municipalities, which was the proportions are more for the immediately impacted, towns around the tribal casinos. I think though at this point we're at almost an all-time low for how much money comes back. The legislature actually passed unanimously through both chambers to increase that money by almost $90 million from that slot revenue that would come back to municipalities. Unfortunately, vetoed by the governor. But when the state is looking at right now an 18% budget reserve fund, I mean, I'm pretty sure my two mayors that I'm looking at right now would be very envious of a 18% budget reserve fund, and that the state is still sweeping money designed to go to municipalities into that reserve fund. I think that's very hard for our towns, and that's why there's hesitancy of if that money's not coming in when there's an 18%, $1 billion surplus, an 18% reserve fund. What's it going to happen when we're not in a surplus but in a deficit? So, new revenue streams don't reduce the burden. As I said, I think the overall theme is how do we reduce what our residents pay? And I think that has to be the underlying driver of, what are we actually charging? Motor vehicle, property, sales, income, all those different taxes. How do we reduce that burden to make this more attractive? We have to figure out how to float the more economy we can build here. A rising boat lifts all tides. And I think we need to, how do we get more out of the pie? How do we make the pie bigger so that there's more for everybody and everyone pays a smaller slice?
Thank you. Thank you so very much, CCM, Collins and Gara Cost. Great presentation, really helpful information we have. I'm sure I will help our members also. So what we learned from this amazing presentation, very much regressive. Also some vehicle registered out of state because avoiding paying the car tax. So for that also losing the registration fee. So that's also another issue we can look into closely. This task force created because we don't want to rush or reason created regressive and also state losing the registration fee, town losing the car tax because that's also burden other residents in the state in town. So of course we have to create how we can generating the lost income for 169 town and city, depending desperately, supporting our school systems and others, So we have more information now. I think it's good idea would be to create two task force, and that both task force to look at way to generate the lost income if we repeal the car tax. And one subcommittee can look at, one subcommittee can look at how to town creating and generating the lost income themselves. Another one can creating and see how they can generating the lost income state and distribute 169 town and cities. These two subcommittee, this is why we create the task force, look into very closely and not rushing, hurting the town and city or individual. So these two subcommittee, I think, I don't know, my co-chair, if you agree, we can put two subcommittee together for one town and one for state. Look closely how they can generate the income and distribute it. And if you like to on any subcommittee, please send email to our clerk, and we will send you the final list. With that, I would like to ask my co-chair if he wants to say a few things also.
I'd just like to thank Cost and CCM once again for presenting today, members of the task force for participating. If you could send that report that you kept referencing. I think that would be helpful as well going forward, just so we could review that if you want to send it to the clerk and we could disperse it to the membership. But thank you once again. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, my co-chair, the amazing co-chair. Yeah, like I said again, we are not going to rush. Make sure we have generate the income and supporting our town and state, not just one time. It's a long run. This is a big hole. This is why we have task force, and now to subcommittee. They're going to also expand. We have genius people on this group, and they can look into how we can generating the income. With that, our next meeting, as time and date and agenda, clerk will send out. And thank you for being here, everyone, and meeting adjourned now. Thank you.